So back in 2007, while I was working at the FBI doing anti-piracy or counterfeiting investigations, specifically I was investigating counterfeit software, the Department of Justice called and asked me to join a delegation traveling to Central America. So it was quite an honor to be asked, but the only problem I had was that it just happened to conflict with the very last day of my Deacon formation program. And that program lasted 5 years. So imagine, I went 5 years, I think I missed maybe 1 or 2 classes over the 5 years, and now at the very last class, I was gonna have to miss. So I was kind of bummed. And that class, would have been the class where, they would pull together the 5 years of formation. But more important for me, that year we spent a lot of time on social justice issues, which is a big part of what deacons do. I had actually worked in a home for people living and dying of AIDS during that year, and I'd also volunteered at my parish in St. Vincent de Paul ministry. So we had done, as part of the formation process, there were lots of reflection periods and things like that, but this was going to be the chance to sort of pull it all together, and I was going to miss it. And I did miss it. But so I felt bad. I kind of felt bad, and I thought, on a whim, I decided to call the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, which is where I was ordained, to call the office and talk to the mission office there, the office in charge of missions, to find out if maybe a parish in Milwaukee had a sister parish somewhere in the area I was going to be in, which was Guatemala and Costa Rica. It was kind of just a whim. I thought maybe, maybe I could go to that parish and visit while I was down there. To my surprise, a couple days later, I get a call, and I find out that there is actually a group going down there from a parish in Milwaukee, and that they had invited me to join them. And it just coincided with the time when I would be finishing up the trip with the U.S. delegation, meeting with Central American officials. So, I planned the trip, everything got planned. I went on the trip, and just as planned, the first leg of the trip, I met with these officials from Central America with the U.S. contingent, and that's what this picture is. This picture is actually the second of 2 meetings. The first was in Costa Rica, and then this one was in Guatemala. In the process, so what I did is I talked about anti-piracy investigations, counterfeiting. The investigation I had was software related, but they were just generally, we were talking about how we did investigations into piracy at the FBI. But I also learned in the process, and just as being part of this contingent and this delegation, I learned that the goal of the U.S. delegation was to convince the countries of Central America to sign the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So I didn't know a whole lot about it. Of course, I tried to learn a lot of it, but we didn't have cell phones back then and stuff, so I couldn't just Google it. So I had not done a lot of research. They didn't really tell me much up front about what our purpose was. I was the expert, and so I just needed to talk about my expertise. But I did meet and start talking with people in the country. So there was a translator who I got to know, who I learned was Catholic, and I started talking to her, and I learned that if the countries in Central America signed the agreement, part of the agreement, one of the enforcement provisions of the agreement would require them to, in particular, shut down one very large company in the region that had been manufacturing drugs using patents they stole from US companies. So, okay, they stole them from US companies, but this translator explained to me that manufacturer sold those drugs to people in just that region for 10% of the cost of what it cost to get them from the United States, from the companies here that manufactured them in the United States. And she also told me that she was really very, very, and I could see it on her face actually, very worried about the people of Central America if the countries signed on. So just a few days after that conversation with her, I joined the Milwaukee group. I met up with the group from Milwaukee in Guatemala City, and I took a 2-hour drive into the interior of Guatemala. And what I experienced for that next week was life-changing. The orphanage, that's the picture you're looking at there, this is an orphanage in the middle there in this city in the Los Gatos, I think, I can't remember the exact name, but It was in the like poorest part, essentially, of the country. And it didn't have running water. Actually, the picture's not in here, but there is a picture of a group. This same group had gone a couple years before and built a gray water system so they could like flush some toilets. But other than that, they had no clean water coming into the compound. They were really poor. I remember actually seeing the clinic. There was a clinic there. It was just a one-room clinic. And I walked in, and there was like one of the volunteers, actually from the U.S., was in there, and I talked to her for a minute. And she said the only medicine they had in the clinic was stuff that we brought, that the contingents, the mission groups from the U.S. brought down there. And it was all over-the-counter stuff, like Tylenol and aspirin, stuff like that. And I talked to her about the drug, what I learned on that previous leg of the trip, and she said these people don't have the money to even afford the 10% cost of the drugs. So I can tell you, like, that experience was just, it changed me for, it actually, I'll just say, I didn't actually include this in my homily in what I wrote up, but I kind of felt like God winked at me, because I'm like, I actually saw social justice right up front. I saw how, what we were learning in Milwaukee, it was really good, but to be there at it was essentially the last day of my class. That was my last class as in Deacon formation, kind of unofficially, but it was probably the most impactful one of my entire studies. I mean, I had been working on, justice, in the United States for many years at that point. It took a trip down to Central America and that experience in that orphanage in Guatemala to open my eyes to what it really meant, what social justice really meant. So we're in week 4 of our series, Made for More. The scripture readings in these first 5 weeks of the year remind us that we were all made for more than our career, our schooling, our relationships, our material possessions. During the series, we've asked you to very intentionally reflect on how you are made for more, using questions from the series guide which we have provided after Masses and on the parish website. Our hope is that the questions have helped you to zero in on God's greater purpose for your life, to identify the guiding principle which transcends your job, your schooling, even your family life. The purpose, God's purpose for your life, that crosses over into all areas of your life. And today's scripture readings give us some guidance on how we can evaluate when we think we found that purpose. So let's take a look. So in today's gospel, Jesus teaches his followers the Beatitudes. In the Beatitudes, he tells us who is truly blessed in his kingdom, and that is the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the clean of heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, and those who are insulted and persecuted because of him. Commenting on the meaning of the Beatitudes, biblical scholar Diane Bergant points out that it's important for us to remember that while the teachings of Jesus are all in some way directed toward the establishment of the reign of God, the type of behavior or values he advocates is frequently the opposite of those espoused by society at large. To Bergant's point, notice that in the Beatitudes, it's not the wealthy, the powerful, the guy with the biggest house or the coolest stuff, or the social media influencer who is blessed in God's kingdom. No, what is valued in God's kingdom is different. God's kingdom is countercultural. Bergant suggests that when we believe we have discovered God's true purpose for our lives, we should test it against the Beatitudes. Does your purpose extend to everyone? Does your purpose make you a blessing to others, especially the least among us? In today's second reading, Paul writes, "Consider your own calling, brothers and sisters," which is really what we're asking you all to do in this series. He goes on, "God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human being might boast before God. I discovered this truth in Guatemala. Before my Guatemala experience, I simplistically wanted to believe that if I worked for justice in the U.S., then I was doing God's justice. But in Guatemala, I saw firsthand that American justice is not necessarily justice for the poorest and most vulnerable people of Central America, those who are valued the most in God's kingdom, according to the Beatitudes. By the way, I'm not attacking the American legal system, and I am not defending the company that violated U.S. patents. I'm simply saying that in enforcing our laws, those who pay the highest price may not be the rich, like the guy who owned that company that made the counterfeit drugs. But it's most often the poorest and the weakest among us. Social justice requires us to consider them when we craft solutions. As you consider God's purpose for you, you should also look to the Beatitudes and ask yourself if that purpose meets those criteria. If you believe that your gift is hospitality or generosity, for instance, then ask, does that hospitality or generosity extend to everyone? Do you extend it to the weak, the lowly, and the despised of the world, the poor, the homeless, the elderly, and the handicapped? What I learned from my experience in Guatemala and what we learn from the Beatitudes in today's gospel is that God's kingdom requires more of us. It requires us to see through God's eyes. And if we each live God's purpose for our life, it will not always be straightforward, easy, comfortable, or simplistic. As I mentioned at the beginning of my homily, as part of this series, we've provided questions for you to answer which help you identify God's purpose in your life. We strongly encourage you to answer the questions if you have not. It may take only one of the questions to spur a thought or a memory which leads you to discover God's greater purpose for your life. For me, it was the January 12th question, the one on the screen now. When in your life have you been so absorbed in something that time just flew by? The answer that immediately came to my mind was when I was working at the FBI. I specifically recalled on several occasions being at work and looking at the clock around 5 o'clock p.m., usually the time I would go home, and deciding to work a little bit later, only to look at the clock again in what I thought was just a few minutes to see that it was now 10 p.m. This made me start trying to figure out what specifically made me lose track of time. What drove me in those situations to keep working and to keep digging, looking for clues or leads in my cases? In past homilies, I've spoken about other parts of my career. After law school, I joined the Marines and I served as a military prosecutor. I enjoyed being in the military, but when my tour ended, I decided to chase a higher paying job. So I joined a large law firm. 6 months later, I was miserable. I missed the military service and I missed the Marines. So I decided to return to government service and joined the FBI. And I loved it. I worked as an agent for the next 13 years. But once again, when a former colleague from DOJ asked me if I wanted to work for him at Apple, I again decided to chase the money. Working at Apple was okay at first, but I soon had that same nagging feeling that I had when I worked at the law firm. So again, I decided to return to government service and went back to the FBI. I worked there for another 9 years and retired in 2021. So I'm sharing this because answering the question on January 12th from the series guide is what led me to notice a pattern in my professional life. And you may discover the same thing if you answer some or all of the questions. In my case, each time I left a job in which my focus in the job had been the pursuit of justice, I was eventually pulled back. Each time I chased more money, something was missing from my life, and I now know what that something that was missing is. It's the same thing that made me lose track of time working those late nights at the FBI, the thing that made me join the FBI in the first place, and the thing that made me return to the FBI after working at Apple. It's why I became a lawyer and why I joined the Marine Corps and serve as a military prosecutor. Once I realized this, I quickly connected this to my experience in Guatemala and realized that God's purpose in my life, service in the pursuit of justice, also crossed over into my personal life, my faith life, and my vocation as a permanent deacon. This week, our series guide is asking us to have a prayer conversation with God about our purpose, a chance to pull together all our reflections on all the input we receive from family and friends. The guide includes instructions for how to do this prayer exercise on your own. But as you see on the screen now, and you saw before Mass, we also want to help you through the prayer process, either tonight at 7 p.m. here in the church. That's tomorrow, Sunday night. Sunday night at 7 p.m. in the church, or on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. over Zoom. This event will last no more than 30 minutes. And if you come or if you join the Zoom call, please be sure to have your notes from the daily reflections, the questions. If you have fallen behind in the daily reflections, please take some time this afternoon, tomorrow, or I guess it'd be this evening, tomorrow afternoon, or before Tuesday to catch up. All the questions can be found on the parish website. You don't need to go through every question, but if you do about half of them, that should be enough. Like I said, it only takes one question, and it'll kind of lead you down that road. But whether you do the prayer exercise with others or on your own, I want to challenge you to complete the process so you can discover and live God's purpose for your life. God has a special purpose for each of our lives. As we heard in the first week of this series, God has given each of us unique gifts and talents. We are meant to share those gifts and talents with others, especially the least among us. And when we discover and share these special gifts and talents with others, we not only find joy and meaning in our own lives, but we discover that God truly made us for more.